have, and I'm just going to ask folks to actually chat and answer. I'm not going to wait and you know, do a formalized poll, but are you using standard share capacity or are you using premium capacity? So if you wouldn't mind just chatting standard or premium, just to get us give us an idea of how many folks are actually using premium. I think that would be helpful for us. But I'm going to go ahead and get started while you're doing that. Thank you for the introduction, Crystal. My name is Paul Turley. I'm a principal consultant here at Pragmatic Works. Also a 9-year veteran of the Microsoft MVP program, currently an MVP in the data platform. But I spend most of my time focused on BI technologies, and I would say most of that time actually working in Power BI. Historically, I've worked with SQL Server, building data warehouses, ETL processes, SQL Server analysis services, both multidimensional and tabular. I've spent a lot of time with SQL Server reporting services in the past. I'm the primary author of all of the Rocks Press professional series books on reporting services and the reporting services recipe book that we wrote back in 2010. So these are all tools that are near and dear to me. When people ask me how long I've been doing this, it kind of depends on what you count, but it's right around 20 years, 25 years in the industry. So you're welcome to reach out to me as long as you're not selling something. So you can see my Twitter handle there. I'm kind of semi-active on Twitter and LinkedIn, but of course you can also contact me through Pragmatic Works, through the Pragmatic Works blog. But love being involved in the community, love working with folks, and that's why I just absolutely love doing BI consulting. So what's this all about? What are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about business intelligence models, particularly data models. And if you spent any time around the Microsoft BI ecosystem, you know that it's all about the data model, that we model data, whether it's in star schemas or snowflake schemas or some hybrid version. It really is all about the data model. That is the foundation of a solid BI solution. And we're going to talk about Power BI enterprise features with respect to how you manage your data in data modeling, in data models, and different modeling choices. We're also going to talk about how things are changing very quickly and how our design tool features are merging. We'll talk specifically about features around high volume and massive scale. I'm going to actually demonstrate a feature that I've been using quite a bit lately, and that's incremental data refresh. I'm just going to reference a real project that I just finished up for a client, not by name, but we'll just talk about that project in broad strokes. And it's representative of a lot of the work that I've been doing for our consulting clients here at Pragmatic Works lately. Talk a bit about composite models, and I'm going to demonstrate parameterization and incremental refresh. And I was kind of curious to see what the responses to my question about whether you're using standard shared capacity or premium. So if you wouldn't mind just chatting that answer, I'd appreciate it. All right, now just to have some fun, I prepared this presentation actually for a live user group meeting. I was supposed to give it last month here in Portland to the Portland Power BI user group. We had a ½ inch of snow on the ground, so they canceled the meeting. Yeah, I know. If you're in the Midwest, you can laugh. So that's been rescheduled. I'm actually going to be giving that presentation tomorrow, but I actually was going to have prizes for those who could quickly answer the pop song references. Now, I'm not going to pause and wait for you to answer, but you'll see that all of my slides are themed with pop songs. The first one is The Way We Were. So who performed that? And we're not all live here, so I can't hear your answers. But that was Barbra Streisand, and that was for a movie of the same name where she co-starred with Robert Redford. So The Way We Were. Serious BI solutions use SQL Server analysis services. That is the modeling engine that has been around for over 20 years now. It was introduced as OLAP services with SQL Server 7.0 actually, and then 2000, and then was renamed Analysis Services in 2000, and then re-architected in 2005. So that's the way it's always been. We've always built a semantic model with analysis services, and then built reports and used BI tools on top of that. And so SQL Server Analysis, the cube, multidimensional, and the kind of person who typically would build an analytic model is a person who might resemble this individual. Not a business user, not a finance person, but a propeller head like us, an IT person who has very specific skills and maybe some tolerance for quirky behaviors and a lot of patience. All right, times they are a-changin'. What's the song reference? Give you a second to think about it. You'd have to be a bit old school to get this, but that was a Bob Dylan song in the late 60s. So times they are a-changin'. How are they changing? Well, Visual Studio has long been the design tool of choice for serious semantic data model design. And particularly an add-in for Visual Studio called SQL Server Data Tools remains a supported tool. And for certain models, it makes sense to continue to use Visual Studio. But I think we're quickly going to refer to this as a legacy design tool. So come together, what does that mean? First of all, what's the song reference? Come on, Fab Four, the Beatles. What's coming together? Visual Studio and Power BI Desktop. What you say? Why Power BI Desktop? That's a self-service BI tool. That's a tool that business users use to do their own self-service data mashups, modeling, and analysis. Well, that's true, but the product team, and I spent 4 days last week with the Power BI product team at the MVP Summit, and I can tell you that a lot of their resources, time and effort are now going into the enterprise story for Power BI that is focused on Power BI Desktop as the enterprise design tool. We won't say officially that it's going to replace Visual Studio, but we will say that that's where the resources are going, that we're going to see a lot of enterprise features light up in Power BI Desktop, and probably not so much effort going into the Visual Studio tool. So that was then, but this is now. What's the song reference? You'd have to be a child of the 80s to get this, because it's a fairly obscure song from an English pop techno group called, not a techno group, but a pop group called ABC. They had Poison Arrow and The Look of Love and When Smokey Sings. So to maintain the rapid pace of development and to continue to support a cohesive BI tool experience, Power BI Desktop is really becoming the recommended enterprise BI tool. Now, it's not to say that we've arrived at that point, but that's where we're headed. And if your efforts are focused on building analysis services models in Visual Studio now, I wouldn't advise you to stop, but I would advise you to take a serious look at using Power BI Desktop moving forward and just making informed choices. So it's a very simple tool. You do your modeling and authoring in Power BI Desktop, you deploy up to the cloud, and what's that peeking its head behind that cloud there? That is an instance of Analysis Services Tabular. And so Analysis Services Tabular actually lives in the Power BI service. And when you deploy a Power BI Desktop file, a PBIX file, it creates a data set with queries. So those are Power Query queries, and it's an analysis services database that we refer to as a data set, and it is analysis services. And we're going to see more and more feature parity between true analysis services and the Power BI model in the Power BI service. So let's talk about enterprise features. Sometimes you just have so much data, and perhaps it's important to have a near real-time experience that the direct query feature in Power BI makes sense. A lot of the times it doesn't make sense. And I work with a lot of new clients who will really kind of reason that we need direct query because we want real-time access to our database, our data sources, our data warehouse. And I always kind of start with a very frank discussion about the trade-offs of direct query. It can be slow, and you lose a lot of functionality with direct query, but it exists for a reason, and it's an important feature. Composite data models give us the ability to get the best out of import cached tables, which means that the data is imported and it lives in memory in a tabular model, and direct query tables that are just a live connection back to the data source. So if we can have a true best of breed solution that gives us the best of both worlds, then that's a big step forward, and that's what composite data models are all about. But because direct queries tend to be very slow, we have a new feature called aggregations that actually allow us to cache the aggregated results of a direct query table, so that at a certain level of grain, you're not going back and hitting the data source. And so, you know, this is part of the maturity of Power BI being very evident. And then incremental data refresh policies, which is the feature I'm going to show you. Very soon, I was just at the MVP summit. A lot of the information is under NDA. So when I say very soon, and I think, oh, I know when this is, it's going to be soon. We're going to have access to the XML-A endpoint for published models in the Power BI service, meaning that you'll be able to talk to Power BI. You'll be able to talk to your data models in Power BI just like we talk to analysis services today. So you'll have access to the same tooling, the same scripting options. You'll be able to script partitions. You'll be able to recreate objects. It's going to come in waves. We're going to have read-only access first, and then eventually we'll have more and more and more features. So watch for the announcement of the XML-A endpoint. It's really going to be a game changer for the enterprise story for Power BI. If you've attended a Microsoft conference in the last year and a half and you've seen a demo given by Christian Wade or other members of the Power BI product team, you've probably seen this demo. Look at that number down in the lower left, 6T, 6 trillion records. So what Christian describes as a clicky, draggy, droppy reporting experience over massive scale data sets. In this case, 6 trillion rows of data. And if we were to put slicers on this report and click around, you would see the interaction between those visuals. It would be very fast. It would act just like any other Power BI report. Over 6 trillion rows of data. How is that possible? Well, it's possible through the magic of composite models, which is a hybrid between in-memory cached imported data and direct query using aggregations. Now, let's back up and talk about data model size limits. So I recently worked with a client who, with the data warehouse that was about 150 gigabytes in size. And they came to me and they said, all right, how many data models do you think we're going to need to be able to surface this data? And I looked at their reporting needs and I said, one. You need one data model because you have a very, very unified set of reporting requirements, and you need to get to data in both of those fact tables in this data model, or in this data warehouse. And so I built a prototype model, and that 150 gigabytes of data, we left out some columns, so let's call it 100 gigabytes of data, compressed to 1.7 gigabytes in the tabular model. So we got massive compression and optimization over a well-crafted star and snowflake schema data warehouse design. All right, so in shared capacity, so if you just sign up for Power BI and buy a pro license, you can publish models that are up to 1 gigabytes in size. So that wouldn't hold that 1.7, 1.8 gigabyte model. But if we move up to premium dedicated capacity, the first SKU, a P1 SKU, at a cost of a few $1,000s a month, would give you 3 gigabytes of storage and memory, which would be sufficient for this project. And then as we scale up, we can go up to 12 gigabytes. All right. Beyond that, if we have very large data models to manage in Power BI, you would need to use analysis services in some form. Azure Analysis Services, again, because it's a number of different service levels, can scale up to 400 gigabytes in size. So that's going to handle some very large data sets. If you are using analysis services on-prem, a SQL Server standard license will give you up to 6 gigabytes. So that's a fairly inexpensive solution. And if you have enterprise licensing with SQL Server, there is no stated limit. So you're limited only by the capacity of your hardware, which could be literally terabytes of memory, and that's going to handle pretty big data. All right, blurred lines. What's this? Obviously a pop song a couple years ago, Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams. They were famously sued by the Marvin Gaye estate over supposed copyright infringement. What do we mean by blurred lines? Well, the decision between Visual Studio and Power BI Desktop, as I've mentioned, is a bit blurred because there are features in analysis services that don't exist in Power BI, and there are features in Power BI that don't exist in analysis services. With the XML endpoint and with continued integration and continued efforts to bring parity between these two tools, right now it's a little difficult to say, yeah, you should always choose this one. But I'm leaning in the direction of Power BI Desktop going forward for most of my client projects. All right, so here's my reference solution. This is a healthcare solution for an unnamed client. I worked on just a couple of months ago. These numbers have actually gone up quite a bit since I captured the screenshot. But here you can see a couple of our larger tables, 16 million rows in one table, 19 million, 20 million. I think we're up to about 35, pushing 40 million rows in some of our tables now. And so in this reference solution, I used incremental refresh. How does that work? I'm going to demonstrate it for you, so I'm going to move through this rather quickly. But the first thing that we want to do is reduce the working data set on our desktop. And the way that we do that is we build a couple of parameters that look like this. And you actually have to use these parameter names, and they have to be date, time, data types, range start, range end. Just create 2 parameters, set some default values, and then for each of your large, typically fact tables that you want to reduce in size in the desktop, you use that range start and range end parameter to filter the table. So you can see here, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. You can see here that I've created a simple filter rows step in Power Query. And again, the documentation shows you how to get through this, but you just say that I want to take a date time type column, and that's key. If I have a date time column, I'm going to have to convert it to date time for this to work. And I want to say is after or equal to range start and is before range end. So that suggests that if you wanted to have one full year worth of data, including all the days in that year, that your parameters would be January 1 of, let's say, 2018 through January 1 of 2019, because we're saying is before that last parameter, the range end parameter. All right, so we set that up, and then you go ahead and load up your PBIX file on your desktop with 1 year of data, maybe 2 years worth of data, so you can test year-over-year measures, or make sure that you can do your modeling, your measure design, your report design, and then we publish that up to the service. This is key. Your query must support query folding. That means that if you're using a SQL Server data source, for example, you want to hit a table or a view, but you don't want inline SQL within your query. If you need to do a bunch of joins and create alias columns or whatnot, use CTEs or unions, build a view to do that so that you're just touching a view, bringing that back, let Power BI do the work, and then it will be able to implement query folding. If you have steps in your query that might break query folding, might undo query folding, that's fine, as long as those steps are after this filter step. So you see the predicate there in the where clause where it's actually performing that filter. And this is where we set up incremental refresh. I'm going to demonstrate this, so I won't take time with it here, but this is a preview feature that you need to enable within the options and settings within Power BI Desktop. We're probably fairly close to it going GA, And I find it to be a very stable feature, a very reliable feature, but just keep in mind that it is currently a preview filter that needs to be enabled in desktop, and then of course you need to close desktop and reopen it to be able to see that feature. So a couple things you can do there. You choose the table, turn on an incremental refresh policy, and then we say we want to store rows where the column, that's my date time column, is in the last, and here I'm saying 5 years. What that does is it's actually going to create 5 separate partitions, one for each of those historical years. Now, in this particular project, we had a very slow running query that was problematic, and even loading 1 year of data at a time, we still had some queries that were timing out. So the way that I mitigated that problem is I said, no, let's do 60 monthly partitions instead. So I just say 60 months. And then if you open up SQL Profiler when you're doing your refresh, you would see that it actually issues 60 separate queries. Current project I'm working on, we're going back 20 years in 1 year blocks. And then we can say, and also refresh the rows where within the last month. So no matter what, go reprocess the last month. Everything else is history, and it'll actually build another partition. If we were running this today, we would always be processing March of 2019, and then we would have a static partition that included January and February of 2019, and then we would have whole yearly partitions of 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, etc. All right, you also have some options there to detect changes based on like a last update column. All right, to cache or not to cache. This isn't a song reference, but it is a nod to the late, great Johnny Cash, even though the spelling is different. All right, imported in-memory data tables provide high performance, but direct query tables offer scalability. They give us near real time. And it is important to note there's still some caching going on there, so it may be near real time up to, let's say, 10 minutes. But Power BI is very, very smart about even caching live queries. So there's a little teeny tiny bit of latency there. But composite models kind of give me the best of both worlds. So how does this work? Well, this is the way it used to be. You either had direct query, one data source, one database, any tables that you want, live connections to every single one of those tables. Nothing is cached. The data does not reside in the service other than a little bit of just momentary caching, just enough to kind of to speed things up a little bit. Or you import everything and you do not have a live connection, and then you only get new data when you refresh your data. Now in premium that could be up to 48 times a day, and so again my leaning is toward import. That's the go-to, that's the default recommendation. But a composite model lets me pick and choose. So now I can say reseller sales, customers, those kinds of things change a lot. Am I doing this the right way? Yeah, those kinds of things change a lot. So I'm going to use direct queries for those tables, but dates, geography, product, and employee, they don't change very often, and so I might refresh those every night or even less often. And I can have relationships between these tables. Okay, that's awesome. But I still can have some performance issues with my direct query tables. And there are also some DAX calculations, some DAX functions that will either not work at all, or will just have very, very poor performance because they translate to very, very heavy queries. Things like, select this entire year and then select everything from the previous year and then do a comparison and calculate a ratio. Those are very, very big queries that can put a lot of load on the data sources. So aggregations mitigate that. It's a brand new feature. It's still in preview. But the way that aggregations work is I can actually generate an aggregation table. I don't have to have a materialized table, but I create this in the designer. And then I can specify here in the aggregation dialog that I want to group by certain keys and then aggregate at a certain level. So for example, here I'm saying I'm going to group by the order date key and in my sales table, and then that data is going to exist at the day level, at the order date key level. And then I can group by order date key, group by customer, group by product subcategory, and then sum up my sales amount and my unit price. And that data at that level gets cached and then refreshed often. So it is, though it improves performance, keep in mind that there can be a timing difference between when aggregates get refreshed and the direct access that you have to these tables. So things get a little more complicated. You need to do a little more planning, probably some prototyping, to be able to use this feature reliably. And it's a brand new feature and we have less experience with it. So another song reference, Show Me the Way. Now it turns out, I didn't even realize this when I chose this song title, that within a very short period of time, within the pop music business, there are actually two songs performed by two different groups that have exactly the same title. One of them was by Peter Frampton, and the other by this group. It's my wife's favorite 70s and early 80s band by Styx. But this is an introduction to our demos. I messed up the timing of that. I was supposed to hold off on the reveal there. Okay, so let's take a look at how you implement incremental refresh. This, in my opinion, is a game-changing feature. It opens the door to some amazing capabilities that we didn't have before. Before incremental refresh, as I talked to clients who had larger data sets that would result in a data model, PBIX file size that may be treading on or exceeding 1 gigabyte, I would say, well, A, you're going to have to limit the size of your data, be very diligent about only including certain columns that compress well, or we'll have to use SQL Server Analysis Services or Azure Analysis Services for our modeling. But, and I believe that, yeah, this is my completed version, so I'm going to go undo my, my change here. I'll just walk you through the work that I've already done. So, make sure that I'm running my Zoom tool. The first thing I'll point out is that I have two parameters right here, range start and range end. Now you can see that they're date time data types because you see the date and the time. But if we go back to modeling, let's go ahead and manage that parameter. There we go. So you can see that it's a date time type. This was the first thing that I had to get used to, kind of growing up with SQL Server. I've always believed in using the most conservative data type because it reduces space, it improves performance, and optimizes the database. And here's an exception where I have to use a date time type simply because that's the way this feature was designed. So I give that a default value. Same thing with range, and it's a very simple thing. And then within my table, you can see that I was here playing with composite models. I have both an import version and a direct query version of one of my fact tables. So here I've actually implemented a row filter. So when I just drop down the filter button over my my date time column, I set up this filter where, just like you saw in the screenshot, I'm saying is after or equal to, and here you choose a parameter, and then you choose the range start parameter, and is before that range end parameter. And actually, you can see here that I set the default there to 12/31, which means I'm going to be missing that day. So just because my OCD is going to bug me, I'm going to actually change this to 1/1/2010. All right, so if I load this data model, I'm going to have 1 year's worth of data. And if we go back to, and I don't want to wait for that to load, since I really haven't made a significant change, we'll say we'll just close, and I'll apply that later on. So you can see in this table, I only have 1 year worth of data loaded in this working set of data. So I would now publish this up to the service. So I'm going to go up to the service where I have this browser window open. And let's go to Paul's demos in this workspace. You can see this is a premium tenant. Now, if you're not working with Power BI Premium, you don't have to pony up $5,000 for your first month. What you can do is go to the Azure portal, and you can light up what's called an A SKU. It's really designed for the embedding, or the embedded capability of Power BI. But if you were to light up, let's say, an A1 SKU, the estimated cost is about $700 a month if you were to leave it on all the time. But you can actually pause that and minimize your cost. And you can actually add that capacity to your Power BI tenant and use that for development and prototyping without actually paying for premium. Once you go to production, then it really behooves you to purchase premium capacity at that point. But that is a good way to get started. I'm going to jump over here to my data sets. Here you can see that I have published another version of my data set. I'm going to go to scheduled refresh. And I do have a gateway configured to connect to my SQL Server. I think I have that service turned off right now, and so let's see if I can get that. Sorry, I hadn't anticipated that my wouldn't be able to connect through my gateway. Let me see if I can fix that real quick. Yep. Oh shoot. Well, I'm going to jump back. Let me go to my reports. Let's go to this one. Okay, good. All right, so I did schedule data refresh, or I just did a manual data refresh with that incremental refresh policy, and then when that refresh, you can see that it actually loaded all of my data. And in this demo version of this database, I have 3 years worth of data. So let's imagine that we have a massive database that it's actually loading up, a couple of gigabytes worth of data. So I have that here in the service, and I'm able to see all of my data. Yet on my desktop, I'm working with a smaller set of data. So if I go back to my PBIX file, where I've only loaded 1 year worth of data, add some measures, make some enhancements to my model, and then I replace that data set, all I have to do at that point is just perform a refresh, and I'm still going to have all of my data. And I don't bear the burden of managing a large file on my desktop and having to push that large PBIX file up to the service. So there you have it. That's how incremental data refresh works. It's a fairly simple feature to use. It just takes a little bit of work to get started with it. And that actually is the conclusion of my presentation. So I'm finishing about 17 minutes early, which will give us some time for questions. So Crystal, at this point, I'm open to questions, and I'm happy to entertain any questions on this topic from members of the audience.
All right, perfect. Do you want me to read them all to you, or do you want to flow through however you want to flow?
Let me see how functional I can be here. So I'm working on another screen.
If you look on your right-hand side, there's a control panel that says that has your microphone and.
Yeah, I've got it open. I just had to compete with the screen resolution here. Okay. All right, scrolling down. Okay, so first of all, let me go ahead and revisit my earlier request to premium versus standard. So I'm just going to do a real quick statistical calculation in my head here and say that about 65% of you are using premium, and we have one person who is on-prem only. And let me just address that, since I really didn't talk about the on-prem experience. By the way, if you'll visit my blog, which you can see on this page right here, this slide, we're in PowerPoint, SQL Server BI blog. I did a presentation last year called The 9 Realms of Power BI. And in that, I get into all of the nuances of different ways that you can build solutions and model data with Power BI. And so if you are limited to on-prem, let's say for security reasons or compliance reasons, or just, you know, we find that with a lot of organizations, it's not a, you know, the law tells us, or, you know, we have a very strict rule that says, you know, thou shalt not put your data in the cloud, where it might actually be more secure than in your data center. It may just be a question of perception and trust. Whatever that is, if you decided to keep everything on-prem, to exceed the 2 GB limit of Power BI Desktop on-prem, you would need to use analysis services. And that's really going to be the case for a long time, in my opinion. But let's move on to the next question. Moving to premium in the next 6 to 12 months. That's great. All right. Boy, a lot of you answered, and I appreciate you doing that. Okay, it seems if we use SSAS for modeling, we are unable to create custom columns and measures in desktop. Yes, that's true. Is there any way around that, consuming our data? The team insists on using analysis services. Patty, you're absolutely right, and the simple answer is no. You have a good understanding of this restriction. The conventional belief, and this was over the past 20 years, is that IT performs data transformation, shaping, and data modeling, and then users consume data. Now, a lot of that has changed in the last few years. One, I think that the average user is technically much more sophisticated than they've been in the past, and there is more of an appetite for self-service BI, and of course we have much more evolved tools now, and I think that others in the industry, Tableau, Qlik, Spotfire, these companies have really brought BI to the masses and have enabled non-IT resources to do their own data modeling. That doesn't fix your problem. If you're using SSIS, that's the way it is. Now, without making any promises or making any false expectations, let me say this, that the Power BI product team have worked very, very diligently over the past 2 years to bring us composite models, to essentially give us the ability to marry up high-scale capabilities like direct query with import tables. And if you were using direct query in lieu of analysis services, you could then convert that PBIX file to a template, and you could hand that to a user and train them up. And I'm talking about a sophisticated user, a data analyst working at a 200 or 300 level. Hand that to that user and support them in adding their own tables. Again, they're still managing a PBIX file. They're not using analysis services, but that's an option. Sometime in the future, I think, I'm going to be very careful about this, I believe that we're going to see the ability to layer data mashups over the top of a direct analysis services connection. In conversations with members of the product team, the answer is yes, we would like to give you that, but architecturally it's a very difficult thing to do. So take that with a grain of salt, but realize that this is a problem that we're all working on. What does semantic mean? Semantic, well, semantic means a word for, it means a representation. It's a language that describes things. So Microsoft's use of the word semantic model means that we build a data model, which is a metadata description that represents things like customer and product and whatever it is that you care about in your business. And so as we connect that to a data warehouse, we have a dimension within our semantic model that represents customer, that comes from a data source of some kind. So really that's just a kind of a generic word that we mean to represent an analysis services cube or a tabular model with, in the past, dimensions, measure groups, and measures. Now in the tabular world, we actually use the word tables and measure groups and measures and columns. So it's just a fancy word that just describes what we do with Power BI. Will we be able to do modeling for SSAS tabular? Well, that was, I think, the same question as before, if I'm understanding the question. What about the size limits of Power BI in the cloud? I think I answered that question, and the question may have been asked before I presented that. So up to 12 gigabytes is the answer with premium in one of the elevated SKUs, one of the elevated service levels. Is it possible to increase the actual presentation window? Oh, this is about my presentation. So water under the bridge there. Currently the breakdown for 2 windows is 50-50. It's hard to see the presentation. I'm interested in, by the way, I did record this presentation. There is a version of it on my blog if you'd like to go back and review it. I'm interested in incremental data refresh. How do you limit tables for refresh while there are some relationships between the tables? I think that I did answer that question. If I didn't fully answer it, then please feel free to post another question or follow up with me offline. The short answer again is that with incremental data refresh, you create these parameters and you give them default values only for the purpose of loading up a small set of data to work with on your desktop. When you create an incremental data refresh policy, the Power BI service takes over and it assigns values to those parameters in order to construct each of these parameters. So this question came up when I spoke at the Redmond Power BI user group last week during the MVP summit, and my answer was, it's just magic. It just happens, and to a point, that's true. It's a very convenient feature, and at a certain point, it just works. Is this setting in Power BI Desktop or the Power BI service? So if I'm understanding the question, do you configure incremental refresh in the desktop or the service? You actually set up the incremental data refresh policies in the service. I'm sorry, I misspoke. In desktop, it's done on the table. So for an import mode table, it's right here. And then a dialog will open where you actually set up the incremental refresh policy. You publish up the PBIX, and then at that point, the service takes over. It is a premium-only feature, and so it will only work if you have premium. Thank you. Love the music references. And thank you, Hiram, for debugging my gateway issue. Appreciate it. How often can you schedule an incremental refresh? So incremental refresh is just something that happens when you schedule a regular data refresh. And because it is a premium feature, the answer is that in Power BI premium capacity, you can schedule up to 48 refresh events per day. And that's probably more than you'll ever need in half-hour increments. In standard mode, we say, well, first of all, in standard, you have up to 8, but you don't have incremental refresh. But you have up to 8 that you can schedule. in 30-minute increments because it's shared capacity. Let's say that you schedule a refresh at 1:30 a.m. There's no guarantee that that's going to run at 1:30 a.m. It gets into a queue, and in a shared capacity tenant, you got lots of tenants out there. It's just like lots of apartment buildings, and everyone has to take their turn. And if you've got noisy neighbors, then it might be 1:45 before your refresh happens. In premium capacity, that's going to happen much, much faster. Where do you see data flows fitting into the overall Power BI architecture? We need another hour to talk about data flows. Data flows are a very important path forward. Data flows are a way, first of all, to allow sophisticated business users to perform their own data mashups and their own queries that can then be modeled in Power BI Desktop, but they're performed in the service through a web browser. So at a very high level, a data flow is an implementation of Power Query within the service. But we also have the whole common data service. So there's this whole architecture, this whole platform the data flows sit on top of, which is constructed of Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage and Azure Databricks. And you've just got all of these marvelous capabilities that will become available. Right now we have machine learning and cognitive services. You have connectivity to dynamic services. And it really is what Microsoft is using to kind of pave the way forward to a completely integrated set of data sets that are governed, that are certified, and can be bound to common data schemas to kind of help users not go sideways and promote things like spreadsheet hell. So that was a long-winded answer for there's just a lot of great stuff coming in terms of data flows. Just saw a demo. You need to set up parameters for data ranges or incremental data fresh. Set up parameter for data ranges or incremental. So I've answered that question. So I think the short answer is yes, you need to set up these parameters, give them ranges, but then incremental data refresh takes over. It seems that $5,000 a month for premium is expensive. I agree. Compared to Azure analysis services using pause and resume if you only want large models. Donald, I agree with your assessment. I can tell you that though there is no specific promise, Microsoft are talking about lowering the cost of that entry point for premium. If you do the math, if you have several hundred users, once you're in production, premium's a bargain. But spending $5,000 to get started is a big step up, and I absolutely agree. And I think we're going to see some relief there. But that's forthcoming. It is a bit of a quandary right now. Did you see any performance hit when joining tables based on more than one column just because you had to add an additional column to combine the values first? Any ideas about that? We're short on time, so I'm going to try to kind of summarize that and give you a short answer. So the question and the issue, as I understand, is that we can only join on one column between two tables. And we can in SQL Server and even in analysis services multidimensional have a relationship between multiple columns. When you concatenate two text type column values together and then form a relationship on that concatenation, that gets optimized by the storage engine. And one, if you're starting with text type columns, you're not going to lose any performance at all. Just given that we have the necessity to do that compared with the ability in multidimensional to do a composite join. However, because to do concatenation, we have to convert numbers to strings, there is some performance loss in doing that. That's a bit of a trade-off, but I would say in my experience that this is not an issue. It's not a performance issue that I've experienced. Generally speaking, I wouldn't worry about it. Sometimes you have to do this concatenation thing to meet that requirement, but you know what? In multidimensional, that happened under the covers anyway. It's still the analysis services engine. It's still doing a lot of the same things, even though we're working with tabular rather than multidimensional. Let's see. I think we can get to the rest of the questions here in the next 2 minutes. I'm going to have to think fast. Let's see. I think report export to Excel is limited to 30,000. Is any way to remedy that? Yes. Use Analyze in Excel rather than exporting to Excel. Analyze in Excel is a wonderful feature. I am a firm believer that if you need to analyze data in Excel, you should be using Excel. And the best way to manage governed BI data is to connect to a single source of the truth. We did it connecting directly to an on-prem analysis services instance in the past. Using the Analyze in Excel feature gives you the best of both worlds, and you don't have to deal with this limitation. I could spend 3 hours talking about this, and if pivot tables aren't your thing, you can use cube functions. When loading data from online services, how is OData feed different from the actual online services? That's a big question that I'm not prepared to answer right now. It's different. OData is probably less efficient than connecting to a service directly, which uses other transport layers. How have you experienced aggregations so far? I'll stop there and just tell you frankly that I've played with it, but I haven't implemented it in production. And that's the case. Having spent the last week at the MVP Summit talking to a lot of other folks, not a feature that a lot of us have really worked with much because it's so new. How much of what you've shown today is available only in premium? Incremental refresh is only available in premium. And I'm going to have to start right there so that we can close off. If you'd like to follow up with me offline, you can do that through my blog or use my Twitter handle right there. Happy to chat with you after the fact. But with 26 seconds remaining, Crystal, I'm going to go ahead and close off, turn the time back to you, and thank you for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate you hosting the webinar. And as for everybody else, I know Paul mentioned that you guys can see the presentation on his blog, but it will also be posted on our website tomorrow, and you guys will receive an email. So if you guys have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me or Paul, and we'll be happy to help. Thanks so much for attending the webinar. And Paul, thank you so much for hosting. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.